Thanks. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Friedemann Findeisen. I'm a creative weirdo from the middle of nowhere. And I'm the board game designer of a game called Cantaloop. Is this the clicker? Right, there you go. So first of all, let me answer this question. What is Cantaloop? Cantaloop is a point-and-click adventure game in the form of a board game. So if you don't know what a point-and-click adventure game is, those used to be some of the first video games that we had. They were kind of puzzle games where you explore an open world, you can talk to quirky characters, pick up seemingly useless items, and combine those items with other items or people or other things in order to solve puzzles to get ahead in the story. And that's exactly what I've done, kind of transported this to the board game medium. So in Cantaloop, every spread is essentially a location. So on the right, you will see the location, and you have these banners so you can interact with everything in that location. And on the left, you have these coded texts, which allow you to read what happens when you interact with everything. Okay? And so in a location, if you want to move to a different location, so this is location 1, for example, in the second game, in the series, you have these arrows that will tell you if you want to go down these stairs, just go to page 2, go to location number 2. And if you do that, you will end up outside the lighthouse, and if you want to go back up inside, you can do that, of course. And in the course of the game, what you do is usually you try to pick up items in the shape of cards, like the one you see right here. And if you hold those cards up against the location, or the objects in the locations, you will get a code. In this case, it's I3P5. That's the one that the arrows are pointing to. You look that up on the page of the left, and that's how you combine items with one another. And that's the entire game already explained, essentially. And now you will solve solve puzzles, meet characters, and try to get ahead in the story. So I said in the beginning that I'm a board game creator. That's only really half the truth, because I really do a lot of very different things, or so it seems. I have a YouTube channel called Holistic Songwriting, where I teach people how to write commercial songs, called Holistic Songwriting, with 400,000 subscribers. I am a songwriter and producer myself, so I created I'm currently working on my second album, where I play all the instruments and write everything and arrange everything. Mix everything. I wrote 2 books, one of which has become a bestseller. I did a Kickstarter, which overfunded by 200% for a product called the Songwriting Decks, which is 5 decks of cards which help you generate ideas for your songs. I teach 1 day a week at the biggest university in the Netherlands called Artes as a music teacher, and I created the biggest songwriting school online in the world, Holistic Songwriting Academy. And so now I'm a board game designer for this board game called Cantaloop. And today I quickly wanted to talk about how this game kind of came to be, what the reasons for me were to create this game, what the backbone of the game is, and why I think it's important for creatives everywhere in pretty much every field. Because this may look to the average person like I'm doing 50 jobs or something like that. But to me, this is all just one thing. It's all, I'm just channeling creativity, and it's kind of the same thing I'm doing for all these products. The mediums might change, but I'm kind of doing the same stuff over and over again. And I'm hoping that by the end of this talk, I'll be able to show you a couple of the things that I've learned in the process of creating all of these products. But today we're going to use Cantaloop to show you that as an example of how I come up with that. So the reason I created Cantaloop is very similar to the reason why I create most of my products, and that is frustration. So in the case of Cantaloop, there were other games on the market already that I really liked, but I was still frustrated because they didn't do the thing that I wanted them to do. And so the big game back then was the Exit series, which I think is a fantastic series. And if it seems like I'm slagging it off at any point in this presentation, I'm sorry. I love this series. I've played every single one of the games. I think the puzzles are incredibly creative. But the one thing that didn't speak to me about those games was the way that the puzzles are structured. And so if you look at the basic puzzle design of the game is you are given a puzzle, represented by this box over here, and you're expected to solve it as quickly as possible. And if you do, you're given the next puzzle, and so on and so forth, until you reach the final puzzle. And when you solve that, you win. And after that, you get a sort of scoring phase, I suppose you could call it, where you calculate how much time it took you to complete the adventure, the game. And you have to look up how many times you asked for help. Basically, there's a help function in the game. And that gives you your final score. And that's kind of how the game works. So the problem I have with this on a mechanical level is that it kind of asks you to be an expert puzzle solver. If I want to play this game well, what I need to do is I need to rush through this game. I need to solve every puzzle as quickly as I possibly can. I shouldn't ask for help. I just need to become an absolute expert at this type of game. And this kind of doesn't agree with who I am as a person, because this is just not how I like to think about the world. So I call this the linear approach. Yeah, so I didn't resonate with this particular aspect of the game. Now, a little while later, this series of games came out, which is probably my favorite other than Cantaloop, of course. This is the Unlock series, which is just great. And it kind of innovated on this principle a little bit, in a sense that you also are given puzzles, but sometimes there will be not really a fork in the road, but you will have an option as to which puzzle you want to solve first, right? So you're given several puzzles at the same time. You still have to solve every puzzle to get to the end of the game, but you sometimes have options, which alleviates frustration because you sometimes have different things that you could be working on at the same time. And it makes you feel like you have a little bit more control of the story of how the game plays out. So I call this the rubber band technique, because it's like a rubber band. You can stretch it a little bit, in separate directions. It will always end up at the same point, but it's a little bit more flexible in that sense. Unfortunately, at the end of that game, we also have a sort of scoring phase. In this case, an app takes care of it. And the app will even warn you, like in the last couple of minutes before your time runs out, go faster, come on, you can do this, you can do this. And then it goes, and then you've kind of lost. And you can still continue, of course. But there's just a lot of pressure. And again, I'm not really connecting with this whole idea of like, hey, come on, be creative, but there's time limit, come on, go, 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 go. So this didn't really resonate with me. And if I look at my favorite series in the point-and-click adventure game genre, like Thimbleweed Park, the Monkey Island series, or the new Legendary games, Grim Fandango is another one. What they do is they do things quite differently. First of all, they don't have a scoring phase. There's no score at the end. You play it because the process of playing is fun. You love solving puzzles, and it's this whole thing of like, oh, I can solve this puzzle because that allows me to solve this puzzle over here. There's no help section. I mean, Thimbleweed Park has one, but the other games don't. If you're stuck, you're just going to be stuck, which is a really uncomfortable thing, I think, especially for mass market games. We always want the player to have fun, and we want them to be in a kind of flow. But for me, one of the best things about puzzle games is being stuck, because that moment when you break through that barrier and you figure out how to do it, that's a great feeling. That's the best feeling you can get as a puzzle solver, I think. And so that kind of worked against it for me. And lastly, there's no time constraints. Quite the contrary, actually. These games seem to tell you, hey, if you can't solve these puzzles, if you can't get ahead in the story, take a day off, turn off your computer, come back tomorrow, look at it with new eyes, and you'll be able to figure it out. And if the puzzles are well designed, which they are in the case of these three games, that's a lot of fun. And that's the best way, I think, to experience this kind of puzzle game. So that's how I came up with the idea for Cantaloop. And the way Cantaloop is structured is quite different from Exit or Unlock, in that it uses a tree that looks a little bit more like this. So I call this the puzzle world, because as you can see, right from the start of the game, you have a lot of puzzles that you could solve. Okay, so if you can't figure out one of the puzzles, that's fine, because there's what feels like a dozen other puzzles that you could be solving all at the same time. Now you still have to solve every puzzle, and they all end up at the finale of the story. But you have a lot of control over how you want to play the game, because which path you take in which order is completely up to you. And so no two people who play the game, or any game in the series, will play it the same way. So when we look at a location in Cantaloop, this is what it might look like. Part of what this puzzle world allows us to do, and this is what I'm really excited about, is that everything that you see in a location is now meaningful. So for example, if you look at this coin down here, that's a riddle, right? You might not know it, but that's a riddle. If you look at this dog over here, that's a riddle. If you look at this door, that's a riddle. If we look at this guy, that's a riddle. If we look at this knife, that's a riddle. Finding out who this guy is, that's a riddle. This skull over here, well, that's just a skull. But if you look at this window over here, that's a riddle. And even this graffiti over here is a riddle. So you could literally say that the locations in Cantaloop are riddled with riddles, okay? And so that's kind of what the game gives you. It gives you an open world that you can explore, and you have to kind of figure out how to use the things in this world. So here's one of the trees that we created for a new game that we're releasing probably next year called Vladimir. It's about a vampire in his midlife crisis. And so this game has 12 entry points. Okay, so there's 12 puzzles you could solve right from the beginning of the game. And even the other puzzles you can kind of see, like right from the start of the game. You might not have the items for it that you need, or you might not have the idea or a certain piece of information that might be useful to solve that puzzle. But basically, the whole world is open to you. There's no pathway that you have to walk through, no room that you leave, and then you enter the next room, and there you get presented with new puzzles. But everything is presented to you right from the beginning, basically. So in creating these puzzles, I like to differentiate between two puzzles and between two types of puzzles. And the first one is the kind of objective thinking when we're creating a puzzle. And the idea of that is we have a series of puzzles, and basically what we tell the player is, hey, do this thing in order to solve this puzzle so you can move ahead in the story. And Exit does this, for example. Exit is quite frank with how it will say something like, find a 3-digit code using these props. Now, it won't say it in those words. It will fluff it up thematically a little bit. But it's pretty straightforward with that. Like, even if you read the cards, the important text that's important for the puzzle will always be highlighted. So you can basically the card tells you can disregard the rest. That's basically not important. The immersion, if you will, the theme is not really important. It's really just these words that you need to pay attention to. And I think that's kind of a shame. Unlock does it a little bit differently, and I think in a really interesting way. But it also has puzzles like this, where you find a cabinet that is locked. That's almost not a puzzle. It's like, well, it's obvious that I need the key, Or you find a door. It's obvious that you need to find, a key in this case. So those are almost non-puzzles in a sense. But that's very objective driven. It's very obvious what you're supposed to do in these situations, either because the game tells you or because the objects tell you pretty much very clearly what you are supposed to do. So the kind of puzzle that the puzzle world allows us to do is what I call the implied type of puzzle. So if we have a puzzle world like this, all we really need to do for the player is tell them, hey, this is the final goal, this is your objective, and we put it at the end of the process. We can just tell them, for example, in Cantaloop 1, it's kind of a heist story. In the first book, you're trying to put together a team. You're trying to recruit a crew, essentially. So that's what we tell the player. Hey, at the end of this game, you will need to have recruited 2 crew members into your crew. That's all. And all the other puzzles, and then we drop you into the world, and you have to figure out how to do that. But there's never a clear path to that. There's always puzzles in the way of that, so to say. But you have to figure out how they connect to that final objective. And so we call that an implied puzzle. And so this might be something like, for example, you come across a river, and on the other side of that river, there's a hammer. We don't have to tell you, you have to get the hammer. We don't have to do anything of the sort. We don't even have to tell you what the hammer is useful for. Sometimes it's just enough to see that there's a hammer on the other side of a river. And so the player will automatically go, well, I might need this hammer for something. Maybe I should go get it. And then the interesting thing is, the player has to start thinking, so the player has to set their own goals, which I think is really interesting. So it asks a little bit more of the player. And then they have to come up with different solutions for how they might figure out how to get this hammer. So it could be building a bridge, human cannoning your way over, building a boat, training a fish, whatever it may be. Sometimes the reality of these games is very distorted in a really fun way. Another thing that we do, and that Unlock and Exit do as well, is that we look at each object, each item that you can collect in the game, and we try to give it kind of a spin. So when you collect a hammer, the obvious thing to do with it would be to hammer in a nail, or to pull a nail maybe, or to destroy something. But that's just one verb. And I always try to encourage my students when I'm teaching them songwriting, just as much as my players when they're playing my games, to look a little bit beyond what an object typically does. So I try to force them to look at all the other verbs that they could find for an object. So you could use a hammer in a multitude of ways, and you could use it in really interesting ways to create an interesting game experience. So for example, you could use it to break a thin wall in order to get into a new area. Or you could climb up like an ice wall or something to reach a new area. Or you could burn it to power an engine, to move a train to a new area. I don't know. You could come up with interesting ways. You could gift it to another character in the game, to exchange it for another object, to bribe them to do something, to pay them for a service, or to enable them to do something which in turn also helps you. There's a quote by Julia Cameron, which I love, from one of her books, The Artist's Way, which goes, "The amount of ways in which you can use a toy is the number of times that a child will play with it." And this is kind of like how I like to think about my items. I try to give them not just one obvious use, I try to give it at least a couple of spins so that your creativity can run wild with this object, and you can really think about, okay, what are some other alternatives that I could use this item as? Okay, so I want to summarize kind of some of the points that I've talked about and kind of bring it to the sort of meta aspect of it and talk a little bit more about creativity in general and how I think these concepts from Cantaloop translate to generating or creating ideas or making products in general. So the first one is this idea of having to come up with your own objectives and coming up with solutions for them, which is something, so we created at Holistic Songwriting Academy, we created something called the Rubin Rule. And we use the Rubin Rule whenever we have a really important project coming up where quality is extremely important. So for example, if you're pitching for a project, like Ariana Grande has a new album coming out and you need to pitch a song, you're writing your first single. So these are songs where the pressure is really, really, really high and you need to create something amazing. What we encourage our students to do is not to focus on quality. Don't try to write the best song. You're going to pressure yourself into writing something overwritten or it's complicated, you never finish it, whatever. What we try to do is we tell them focus on quantity. Try to come up with many things. And so the Rubin Rule is whenever you have one thing that's really, really important and that it needs to be really excellent, create 5 things instead really quickly, like write 5 songs in the course of 2 or 3 hours. They don't have to be good. Just write 5 songs that are kind of give you a feel of what these songs are, and then pick the best one from those. And we do that at every stage of the process. If you have a verse that you're not happy with in a song, for example, write 5 verses and pick the best one. Don't try to really conceptualize it too much. Just kind of move through it. Keep the flow going. I think that's really important for creative people to have that sense of flow. The second thing is in looking at objects in a multitude of ways. This is something that we call challenging the medium. So there's 2 ways of we have to make decisions when we create products, right? That's just the reality of it. And decidere, so the Latin word for to cut off, right? Because it means you're cutting off one of your options, essentially. And a lot of people tend to think about making decisions in this way. You're kind of eliminating options and you're kind of arriving at a common goal or like a final product. The way I like to think about it is, well, if you make a decision, it also enables you to do certain things. For example, when I decided for Cantaloop to use a book, I started to think, well, okay, let's challenge the medium. What can a book do? What is something I can do with a book that I couldn't do with a video game? And so there are some puzzles in Cantaloop that you couldn't possibly put in a video game, right? Because the video game is not a physical object. So it uses the physicality of the object to give you some puzzles. So challenging the medium, thinking about the objects that you're using, thinking about the tools that you're using, and the ways in which you could use them to tell your story, to make your product more unique, I think is a really, really important rule. And finally, this is more of a way of looking at the world, I suppose, is what I call trusting the process. Is when you see a painter draw something, they'll usually start with just very broad sketches. Like just, okay, this is kind of where the nose is going to be and chin over here somewhere, and maybe a little bit of hair. And it looks terrible. The first version looks terrible. What beginners, and especially we have this with songwriters quite a bit, will try to do is they try to write the perfect section. They're trying to paint the perfect nose or the perfect eyeball, right? And then they never finish their songs, they never finish the painting, it never gets done, or when they do, it's a mess because it's overwritten, it's too much went into it. So instead, what we try to teach our students is trust the process. Trust that every stage is not going to look great, but it's going to get you closer to your final goal. Just kind of like in Cantaloop, where there are things that you do where you're not sure why you're doing them exactly, but you just know that the game, it requires you to solve all of those puzzles, and everything will eventually lead you to one common goal. And to bring it to maybe an even larger perspective here, this is kind of what we do as creative people. This is kind of what I've done in my life quite a bit, is where I've done a lot of things in my life where I didn't quite know, like I did it for a project and I was struggling with something, with learning a new skill, for example, and I needed it for one project and I felt like, I'm not sure if I'm ever going to use that again. And then many years later, down the line of this tree, so to say, something would come up where I go, oh, I've done that before. I can use that here. And I think that's what brings a new perspective to this project, because I have this experience from way down the line, something I did long time ago. And so I encourage creative people to think more in terms of everything you do will eventually kind of help you along your path. Don't try to be too much of an expert creative person. Try to do stuff and trust the process. Trust that eventually all of that will come together in one final point. I'll be here a day. Thank you very much for listening. If you want to come talk to me, I'll be here in person, but you can also check out my email on my website. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.